Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, did we all get to at least skim through chapter 10? The chapter Lee Strobel interviews a man named Louis. I think you say his last name Lapidus. I think that's how you say it. If not, I don't know. If he ever watches this video, he can sue me for damages for mispronouncing his name or something like that. But we're looking at another specific question. So within the last several weeks, we have established that A, based on the available documentary evidence, Jesus really did claim to be God. We've established that B, according to the standard operational definitions of insanity, Jesus really was not insane. And C, we've established that the depictions of Jesus that we find in the most reliable historical sources, that would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, lines up perfectly with the Old Testament's depiction of the God of the universe. Now we have to cover yet another standing question mark, and that is, does Jesus, as described in the four Gospels, actually fulfill the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah? Did Jesus actually fulfill the Messianic prophecies in the Old Testament? That's going to be the question that we're addressing for today. So before we dive heavy into any of the specifics, was there anything that really stood out to anybody? Anything that really gripped you in this week's chapter?
For me, it was so much evidence
Mm-hmm.
that I had not even thought about or considered, that it's so much evidence in the Old Testament
Mm-hmm.
to support that Jesus was the Messiah.
Yeah, that's good. That's exactly right. Anything else? What stuck out to you from this chapter? Anything that really connected with you, really resonated with you? So, I wasn't sure exactly where to start this week's lesson, I guess. I wasn't sure exactly what examples to use to kind of set the stage for what we would talk about. But I think the best place to start this morning is to talk a little bit about something called counter-missionary organizations, or counter-missionary seminars. You might have, I don't know, I'm sure that at some point at maybe the PNC Arena down in Raleigh, or at the whatchamacallit, the place for the fine arts, the place they always have plays and orchestras and all that stuff. I'm sure that at some point there's been either an Outreach Judaism seminar or a Jews for Judaism seminar, something like that. These are counter-missionary organizations that were established by modern-day synagogues, Jewish scholars, others kind of along those lines, meant to do one thing, and that is disprove the Messianic prophecies from the Old Testament. Outreach Judaism is a very famous one. It's run by a rabbi named Tobiah Singer. He's a very intelligent man. Similar thing, Jews for Judaism. It's much smaller, but it's also very influential. It's run by Rabbi Michael Skobac. I like the way that Michael Skobac puts it, even though he's very much incorrect. He puts it about as succinctly and sharply as it can be put. Michael Skobac from the counter-missionary organization Jews for Judaism says, Christians approach the Jewish Bible with a preconceived agenda. They ultimately see what's not there, and they don't actually see what is there. This convoluted approach leads them to quote passages out of context so that they can inject their own beliefs into our Jewish Bible. That's Michael Skoback from the counter-missionary organization Jews for Judaism. It's an org specifically designed to disprove what we believe about Jesus being Messiah. That's a 2,000-year-old project. You might remember from some previous weeks, we've read a little bit from the Talmud. That's an ancient Jewish collection of documents. There's actually 2 Talmuds. They're ancient Jewish collections of documents written by rabbis, written by Jewish theologians, other things like that. They date all the way back into the 1st century A.D. So they date all the way back into the time of Jesus. And quite a bit of what we find in the Talmud is specifically designed to debunk what Christians believe about Jesus. Ever since the death and resurrection of Jesus, there have been rabbis, there have been scholars, there have been theologians and so forth writing from the synagogue, from within Judaism, specifically trying to disprove what we believe about Jesus. We're actually going to talk a little bit about that some more later in today's Bible study, but Outreach Judaism, Jews for Judaism, these are just a couple of organizations standing in that kind of 2,000-year-old tradition. And so because there are so many organizations like Outreach Judaism, like Jews for Judaism, making the same argument again and again, the argument that Jesus is not the Messiah, that Christians have misinterpreted the Messianic prophecies, we want to take a look at just a little bit of the biblical evidence that points us to the reality that Jesus is the Messiah. We want to look at just a handful of the passages that we are drawing from that have kind of paved the way for us, that have pointed us towards Jesus and highlighted him with a bright yellow sign that says, "This is the Messiah that we've been waiting for." I've done these in no particular order. I would actually have benefited from rearranging these a little bit to build up dramatic tension, stuff like that, but I've just got to put them together. I did the basic research for this several weeks back, and then yesterday I tried to put it into an actual outline, and it was a little bit hurried, but let's take a look at some of the passages that point us towards Jesus, the Messiah, throughout the Old Testament. First things first, we want to talk about Deuteronomy chapter 18. This is a famous passage from Deuteronomy, and this is frequently referred to by Christian theologians and others as the prophet greater than Moses prophecy. Don't worry about it. I'll handle it. This is the prophet greater than Moses prophecy. Moses says while the Israelites are gathered, he's on his deathbed. Deuteronomy is the last several sermons that Moses preached to the Israelites out in the wilderness after speaking with the Lord again. These are like his last words. These are like, your last will and testament. You write out the things you want your child to know that you're not going to be able to tell them because you don't have any time left. This is Moses doing that. And one of the things he says as he's dropping kind of his last will and testament is, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own brothers. You must listen to him. This is what you requested from the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, let us not continue to hear the voice of the Lord our God, or see this great fire any longer, so that we will not die. Then the Lord said to me, they have spoken well. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I command him. I will hold accountable whoever does not listen to my words that he speaks in my name. The Lord is saying through the prophet Moses that one day another prophet is going to come. And this prophet's going to be like Moses, but better than Moses. Moses speaks for God in a very limited capacity, right? Moses speaks for God in a very finite capacity, in a very kind of partial capacity. The only time that Moses is speaking fully for God is when he's literally quoting him, right? Similar to the way that every single Sunday I get up into the pulpit and I deliver a sermon. But when I preach, am I speaking for God? Speaking about God, right? I'm pointing you towards God. But I'm human. I make mistakes. I might misinterpret the Bible on some point. That's part of why we do so much study to prepare, because we want to do everything we can to make sure everything we say up there is absolutely correct, but something's going to slip through, right? I'm going to screw up. You ever heard a preacher preach something that was obviously full of it? I know about some of the previous preachers. I know the answer is yes, right? And so we make mistakes. So when we step up into the pulpit, we are not speaking for God. We are speaking, and we're doing it for God, but that's a different thing than speaking for God, right? The only time that I am clearly, uncomplicatedly, unmistakably speaking for God in the pulpit is when I literally quote the Bible, right? Similar thing is true with Moses. He's been vested with a unique authority, and yet he only actually speaks for God when he is literally relating his words to the people. And yet here on his deathbed, Moses says, another prophet is coming, and he's going to be like me, but better than me. Because he's not going to have to quote the Bible to speak for God. He's not going to have to quote God to speak for God. This prophet is coming, and when this prophet speaks, God speaks. When this prophet speaks, you're hearing the words of God unmediated. When this prophet who is coming speaks, it won't be like one of the scribes. It won't be like one of the theologians. It won't be like one of the scholars. He's going to speak with authority. He's going to speak with God's authority. Who does that sound like to you? Sounds like Jesus, right? He steps up onto the mountaintop in Matthew 5 through 7, and he starts delivering this sermon, right? Now, when he does that, he's already evoking imagery that would remind people of Moses, right? Because years earlier, another guy got up on a mountaintop, right? Moses climbed the mountaintop, and he met God on the mountaintop. Then he came down from the mountaintop, and he relayed God's words to the people. And yet, with Jesus, he climbs up onto the mountaintop, just like the prophet Moses. But instead of listening for God, then coming back down and relaying God's words, Jesus climbs up to the mountaintop like the prophet Moses. Then he turns around and faces the rest of the people. And then he speaks as God from the mountaintop. Jesus is playing the role of both Moses and the God on the mountaintop here. He's a prophet like Moses, but better than Moses. He's a prophet who speaks the words of God, just like Moses promised. So Deuteronomy 18, first things first. He's pointing us towards Jesus. But Jesus is so much more than a prophet who speaks for God, right? We see something very similar in Isaiah chapters 52 and 53. I'm going to read them almost in their entirety to you. I apologize for how long this is going to take in advance. Look at Isaiah chapters 52 and 53. I'm starting off in verse 13 of Isaiah 52. The Lord says through the prophet Isaiah, "See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and greatly exalted. Just as many were appalled at you. His appearance was so disfigured that he did not look like a man, and his form did not resemble a human being. So he will sprinkle many nations. Kings will shut their mouths because of him, for they will see what had not been told them, and they will understand what they had not heard. Who has believed what we have heard? And who has the arm of the Lord been revealed to? He grew up before him like a young plant and like a root out of the dry ground. He didn't have an impressive form or majesty that we should look at him, no appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of suffering, who knew what sickness was. He was like someone people turned away from. He was despised, and we didn't value him. Yet he himself bore our sickness, and he carried our pains, but we in turn regarded him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced because of our transgressions, crushed because of our iniquities. Punishment for our peace was on him, and we are healed by his wounds. We all went astray like sheep. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has punished him for the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb led to the slaughter, and like a sheep silent before her shearers, he did not open his mouth. He was taken away because of oppression and judgment. And who considered his fate? He was cut off from the land of the living. He was struck because of my people's rebellion. They made his grave with the wicked and with the rich man at his death, although he had done no violence and had not spoken deceitfully. Yet the Lord was pleased to crush him severely. When you make him a restitution offering, he will see his seed. He will prolong his days. And by his hand, the Lord's pleasure will be accomplished. He will see it out of his anguish, and he will be satisfied with his knowledge. My righteous servant will justify many, and he will carry their iniquities. Therefore, I give him the many as a portion, and he will receive the mighty as a spoil, because he submitted himself to death and was counted among the rebels. Yet he bore the sin of many and interceded for the rebels. That's what traditionally Christian theologians have referred to as the suffering servant prophecy. The Messiah to come is not just going to be a prophet like Moses, but better than Moses. The coming Messiah is going to be a servant of God who suffers for the people of God. He's going to be a servant of God who does absolutely nothing wrong. He did not raise his hand against another, it says. He did not speak a curse on anyone else, it says. He didn't do anything warranting punishment, and yet this this servant is going to be punished. But he's not just going to be punished. In the really strange logic of Isaiah 52 and 53, this servant who didn't do anything wrong is going to be punished for the people of God. He's going to be punished in some sense instead of the people of God. In the larger context of what Isaiah is talking about throughout these later chapters in Isaiah, he's talking about the Babylonian exile. The people of God have been cast out from their land. Remember that from Sunday school? They've been kicked out of Israel. They've been kicked out of Judah. They've been shipped off. They've become refugees in other lands. They've become literal captives in other lands. And as a result, they were saying things like, where is Yahweh? Why didn't you let this happen? Has our God been defeated? Has our God been overcome by the Babylonian gods? Was the king of Babylon stronger than the God of Israel? And to all of this, God says, you've been exiled for the same reason you were exiled from the gardens. You continually rebelled against me in the garden, so I lovingly exiled you for a time. And in the same way, you've continually rebelled against me here in the promised land, so I'm lovingly exiling you for a time. But I'm not exiling you forever. I'm not abandoning you forever. I'm not kicking you out forever. One day, I am going to bring you back, not just to the promised land. I'm going to bring you back to my presence. I'm going to bring you all the way back. I'm not just going to undo the exile from the promised land. I'm going to undo the exile from the garden, the exile from the beginning. And the way that I'm going to do that is through this suffering servant. All of the sin and rebellion that got you exiled from Israel and Judah, this suffering servant is going to take on the punishment in your place. All the sin and rebellion that got you exiled from the garden, this suffering servant is going to take on that punishment in your place. He's going to be pierced for your transgression. He's going to be crushed for your iniquities. The Lord will be pleased to crush him, not because he enjoys crushing the suffering servant, but because he enjoys rescuing you through it. And so this suffering servant is going to be punished for your sin. So the Messiah is going to be a prophet who speaks for God and a servant who suffers in our place. But that's still just the beginning. We're about to get weirdly specific. About 40 chapters earlier in the book of Isaiah, in an earlier section, the Lord says through the prophet Isaiah. Anybody just remember off the top of your head what Isaiah 7:14 is? It's the Christmas verse. It says, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive, have a son, and name him Emmanuel. There's a couple of elements it's good to notice there in Isaiah 7:14. It's a lot shorter than the last passage, but it says just as much. A virgin is going to conceive. Somebody who has never done the thing that causes babies to get made, right, is going to conceive. A lot of people have a misconception about that. A lot of people today especially believe that there is something bad or dirty or wrong about sex, right? There's not. Now, there's a right time and place to have sex, and there's a wrong time and place to have sex, right? There's a correct context to have sex, and there is an incorrect context to have sex. Same thing is true about literally everything else, right? Like there is a correct context to drive your car. There's an incorrect context to drive your car. It's a good thing to drive your car up to the YMCA building and into a parking spot, right? It is not a good thing to drive your car inside the YMCA building and into the swimming pool, right? Very simple. Same thing is true for sex. It is a good thing to have sex within the context of your covenant marriage. It is not a good thing to have sex outside of that context. In your marriage, it's like driving your car to the YMCA. Outside of your marriage, it's like driving the car into the YMCA swimming pool. This is simple. And yet, the reason I talk about all that is that a lot of people think the reason Jesus had to be born of a virgin is because sex is bad. And so the only way that God could be born in the human form was to be born separated away from sex. That has nothing to do with it. Jesus is born of a virgin for exactly one reason, and that is that it draws attention to how unique Jesus is. It draws attention to the fact that the birth of Jesus is miraculous. It draws attention to the fact that in Jesus, God is doing something unique that he has never done with anyone else before. It puts a gigantic exclamation point over the head of Jesus. It has nothing to do with the sex thing. It's part of a long tradition throughout the Old Testament of miraculous births. Barren women like Hannah are miraculously enabled to give birth to people like Samuel, right? In the same way, virgin women like Mary are miraculously given the ability to give birth to this miraculous child, Jesus. And so Isaiah says the virgin will conceive, have a son, and name him Emmanuel. Now that name, Emmanuel, is really interesting. That name means God with us. God with us. A lot of translations kind of soften this a little bit. They say God is with us. And that's not wrong, exactly. But it misses the meaning just a little bit. Because if the virgin conceives, has a son, and names him God is with us, it sounds like you're looking at your kid and saying, God is with us, right? But if the virgin conceives, has a son, and says, God with us, that's a lot stronger, isn't it? That means the virgin is looking at her son and saying, this son is God with us. And so according to Isaiah 17, the coming Messiah is going to be 1, born of a virgin, right? 2, the coming Messiah is going to be male because it's a son. And 3, the coming Messiah is going to be God with us. The Messiah is not just going to be a prophet. The Messiah is not just going to be a sacrifice for us. The Messiah is not just going to be a miraculous birth. The Messiah is going to be God with us. All the way back in Isaiah chapter 7, the Lord was already telling us that he was going to take on human flesh, be born of a virgin, and live alongside of us. That's what we call the virgin birth prophecy. But the virgin birth is actually the least interesting part of that prophecy. Does that make sense to everybody? I can never tell when everybody's looking down. I don't know if that means I'm confusing people or if that means they're writing a bunch or what. But, okay. Now, one thing that's really important to point out, so Tobias Singer from Outreach Judaism and Michael Skoback from Jews for Judaism. They'll actually take aim at Isaiah 7:14 a lot. Here's the reason why. Without getting into really complex technical stuff, the Hebrew manuscripts of Isaiah 7:14 do not say the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son. They say the young maiden will conceive and give birth to a son. They say that the young woman will conceive and give birth to a son. They use the word that you would use to describe a young girl who is probably a virgin because of her age, but the word itself doesn't actually mean virgin. And so a lot of counter-missionary organizations and a lot of contemporary like practicing Jews will point that out, and they'll say, in the original Hebrew, it doesn't actually say anything about a virgin. Here's the problem with that. The Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament that we currently have are probably actually later than the earliest Greek manuscripts of the Old Testament that we have. This is me being as non-technical as I possibly can, I promise. So, the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew. Then eventually translated into Greek. Then all kinds of other languages, right? Eventually translated into Egyptian, eventually translated into Aramaic, eventually translated into all different languages, right? But so originally it would have been written in Hebrew, eventually translated to Greek. But here's the thing. The Hebrew manuscripts that we have of the Old Testament are actually much later than the Greek manuscripts that we have. I wish I remembered the exact year, but the earliest Greek manuscripts of the Old Testament that we have possession of are significantly earlier, by hundreds or more years, than the Hebrew manuscripts we have. And there are very good reasons to believe that the Greek manuscripts we have are actually more accurate than the Hebrew manuscripts we have of the Old Testament.
What does it say in the Greek?
Huh?
What does it say in the Greek?
That is the next thing. And in the Greek manuscripts that we have, take a wild guess what Isaiah 7:14 says.
Virgin.
She was a virgin.
Virgin. Yeah. It says the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son. And so if you're ever reading a book or a magazine article, you're having a conversation with somebody and they say, the original Hebrew doesn't actually say virgin, you could say something along the lines of, well, yeah, the Hebrew doesn't, but that doesn't mean it's original. The best manuscripts we have say virgin. And in fact, the Hebrew manuscripts that we have, quite a few of them, the ones that do not say virgin, actually date to after the life of Jesus. Most of the Hebrew manuscripts we have that don't say virgin actually date to after the life of Jesus. And so the manuscripts that don't say virgin all come after the virgin birth happened. Funny how that works, right? This guy is born of a virgin, fulfilling that Messianic prophecy, but you don't want to accept him as the Messiah. And then suddenly, all your manuscripts don't say virgin anymore. Interesting, right? In a very similar way, a whole lot of the kind of counter-missionary organizations have gone out of their way to try and sort of delegitimize Isaiah 52 and 53. A lot of them have specifically thrown quite a bit of work into trying to argue that Isaiah 52 and 53 are actually about the nation of Israel. Now let me ask you, I just read Isaiah 52 and 53 to you about the suffering servant who takes on the sin of the people in their place in order to reconcile them to God. Does that sound like it's about a nation? No. Exactly. So this is the virgin birth prophecy. Now, moving on a little bit, we get to Micah chapter 5, verses 2 through 5. This is what a lot of Christian theologians have referred to as the king from Bethlehem prophecy. Micah chapter 5 says, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, you are small among the clans of Judah, but one will come from you to be ruler over Israel for me. His origin is from antiquity, from eternity. Therefore, he will abandon them until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. And the rest of his brothers will return to the people of Israel. He will stand and shepherd them in the strength of Yahweh, in the majestic name of Yahweh his God. They will live securely, for then his greatness will extend to the ends of the earth. He will be their peace. It's the king from Bethlehem prophecy. So once again, what all do we see here? First, the coming Messiah will be a king who comes from where? Bethlehem. That was a backwater that nobody thought about. It's not a famous city. It's a place you didn't go. And yet they say this coming Messiah is going to come from Bethlehem. But it goes further than that. Because this coming Messiah doesn't just come from Bethlehem. He's going to be born in Bethlehem. And yet his origins are going to date back a lot further. The Lord says through Micah, his origin is from antiquity, from eternity. This coming Messiah, who's going to be born in Bethlehem, might be born in Bethlehem, and yet long before he was ever born, he already existed. It says his origins are from eternity. Remember last week we talked a little bit about the eternality of God, right? God is forever. There was never a time when God was not. This type of thing breaks the limits of human language, right? Same thing is going to be true of this coming Messiah. This coming Messiah that Micah is prophesying about is not just going to be a man. He is not just going to be a prophet. He is not just going to be a sacrifice. He is not just going to be a dude who was born through miraculous circumstances. He's going to be eternal. This coming Messiah, who's going to be born in Bethlehem, has always existed all the way back into eternity and will exist all the way into eternity. And yet somehow, in Bethlehem one day, he is literally going to be born out of a woman. Yeah. Who's a virgin. So he says he will stand and shepherd them in the strength of Yahweh, in the majestic name of Yahweh his God. They will live securely, for then his greatness will extend to the ends of the earth. He will be their peace. Ultimately, one day, this Messiah who was born in Bethlehem is going to be actively king over everything. His throne is going to extend to every corner of the earth, and he will become our peace. When Jesus is enthroned, over all the earth. Then we'll be at peace. That last part of the prophecy hasn't happened yet. And yet the first part has. So we can have firm confidence that the second part will. Right? That's the king from Bethlehem prophecy. In the same way, you get to Psalm 41 and Psalm 55. This coming Messiah is going to be betrayed. After everything we've already learned about this coming Messiah, we now learn that it's not going to be smooth sailing for him. Everything is not going to go well during his time on earth. Psalm 41, the psalmist speaking from the perspective of the coming Messiah says, "Even my friend in whom I trusted, one who ate my bread, has raised his heel against me." Anything like that happen in Jesus' life? Yeah. Same thing in Psalm 55. The psalmist, speaking from the perspective of this coming Messiah, says, "Now it is not an enemy who insults me, otherwise I could bear it. It is not a foe who rises up against me, otherwise I could hide from him. But it is you, a man who is my peer, my companion, and good friend. We used to have close fellowship. We walked with the crowd into the house of God." These are the betrayal prophecies.
Where are they?
Psalm 41, Psalm 55.
They're what prophecies?
The betrayal prophecies. Yeah. So the coming Messiah, the prophet who is greater than Moses, the sacrifice for the sins of his people, the virgin-born king from Bethlehem, is going to be betrayed by his friend. Even more than that, we see in Psalm 22 something that Christian theologians have typically called the false accusation prophecy. Psalm 22, the psalmist, speaking from the perspective of the coming Messiah, says, "I am a worm and not a man, scorned by men and despised by people. Everyone who sees me mocks me. They sneer and shake their head. They say, 'He relies on the Lord. Let him rescue him. Let the Lord deliver him, since he takes pleasure in him.'" Fast forward to the day of the crucifixion. What did the crowds say to Jesus? They said, "He relies on the Lord. Let the Lord rescue him." Right? He said, "Let the Lord deliver him, since he takes pleasure in him." The crowd said, "He saved so many others. Why can't he save himself?" That's Psalm 22. This coming Messiah is going to be falsely accused, and then he's going to be mocked when he's punished for that false accusation. Then we see exactly how he's going to be punished later in Psalm 22. The psalmist, once again speaking from the perspective of the coming Messiah, says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from my deliverance, from my words of groaning?" He says, "Many bulls surround me. Strong ones of Bashan encircle me. They open their mouths against me, lions mauling and roaring. I am poured out like water. All my bones are disjointed. My heart is like wax melting within me. My strength is dried up like baked clay. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You put me into the dust of death, for dogs have surrounded me. A gang of evildoers has closed in on me. They pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. People look and stare at me. They divide my garments among themselves. And they cast lots for my clothing. Any of that sound familiar? So this suffering servant that Isaiah talks about in Isaiah 52 and 53, now we see a little bit of what it's going to look like when he is pierced for our transgressions. When this suffering servant is crushed for our iniquities, it's going to feel very much like he's been abandoned by God, forsaken by God. They're going to cast lots for his clothing. They're going to pierce his hands and feet. He's going to faint and grow weary. He's going to wither as he's punished. That's the crucifixion prophecy from Psalm 22. But it doesn't end with the crucifixion, does it? Because as we move to Psalm 16 and then a little more from Isaiah 53, we see what theologians have generally referred to as the resurrection prophecy. In Psalm 16, David is writing. He's writing from the perspective of the coming Messiah. He says, "Therefore my heart is glad and my tongue rejoices. My body will also rest secure because you will not abandon me to the grave, nor will you let your Holy One see decay." This coming Messiah is going to be crushed for our iniquity. He's going to be humiliated when he is crushed for us. And yet it's not going to end there. Because the Lord is not going to abandon the coming Messiah to the grave. The Lord is not going to allow the coming Messiah's body even to decay. He's not going to stay dead even long enough for his body to start smelling. Instead, he's going to raise him up. Let's look back at the latter part of Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53, the Lord says, "Yet the Lord was pleased to crush him severely. But when you," that's capital Y-U, God, "make him a restitution offering, he will see his seed, he will prolong his days, and by his hand the Lord's pleasure will be accomplished. He will see it out of his anguish. He will be satisfied with his knowledge. My righteous servant will justify many, and he will carry their iniquities." The Lord has made him a restitution offering, like we see in Psalm 22, like we see in Isaiah 52. He's been crushed for our iniquities, but after being a restitution offering, now the coming Messiah will prolong his days. His days just got cut off. And yet now they're going to be prolonged. His days just got cut short. And yet now they're going to be elongated by the hand of the Lord. He's going to be lifted up out of his anguish. He's going to be raised back up. He will not see decay. He will not be abandoned to the grave. That's what we call the resurrection prophecy. almost done. But we get to Zechariah chapter 11. And we see a much less interesting one. But hey, let's roll with it anyway. This is just an example to see how minute some of the details that Jesus fulfills are. This is what we call the 30 pieces of silver prophecy. So through the prophet Zechariah, the Lord does a little bit more performance art. Remember how we talked about God doing performance art last week? The story with Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman, right? He does a little bit of performance art to teach the disciples about God's love for the Gentiles. That's a common thing throughout the Scriptures. I don't know if we got to talk in depth about it last week or not. I don't remember. But all throughout the Scriptures, God will grab somebody, usually a prophet of some sort, and he will teach the people something, either about what he wants from them, or about what he's going to do with them, or about the coming Messiah, or whatever. He will teach them not through the spoken word, but through performance art, by visually representing it for them. And so, case in point, God teaches the Israelites and the Judahites about the depths of their sin and wickedness through the prophet Ezekiel by making Ezekiel poop, then pick it up, and then cook it over the fire, and then sleep next to it like it's a baby. Which is weird, right? Like I say a lot, the Bible is weird. But in a similar way, the Lord does some performance art through the prophet Isaiah. No, sorry, not Isaiah, Zechariah. He does some performance art in Zechariah 11. He has Zechariah take on multiple flocks of sheep. Then he has Zechariah treat one flock very well and then one flock very poorly. And then he has Zechariah abandon that flock entirely. He's communicating a message about the shepherds of Israel. The shepherds of Israel have abandoned their duty to shepherd Israel in holiness, in righteousness. And so he says in Zechariah 11, if it seems right to you, give me my wages, but if not, keep them. So they weighed my wages, 30 pieces of silver. He's doing performance art through Zechariah. Zechariah has this duty to Israel to shepherd these sheep. And yet he abandons his duty for 30 pieces of silver. He betrays the Lord he's devoted to for 30 pieces of silver. Within the context of this weird performance art piece. He's pointing towards the coming Messiah who will ultimately be betrayed by another shepherd. Yeah. Judas is the shepherd called by the Lord, but who ultimately betrays him for 30 pieces of silver. We call that the 30 pieces of silver prophecy. And then finally, one of the most difficult to explain, but one of the most interesting, comes from Daniel chapter 9. And I don't even know what to call this one. As far as I know, there's not a standard name theologians have given to it through the years. In Daniel chapter 9, he says, while I was speaking, praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my petition before Yahweh my God concerning the holy mountain of my God, while I was praying, Gabriel, the man I had seen in the first vision, came to me in my extreme weariness about the time of the evening offering. He gave me this explanation. Daniel, I've come to you now to give you understanding. At the beginning of your petitions, an answer went out, and I have come to give it, for you are treasured by God. So consider the message and understand the vision. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to bring the rebellion to an end, to put a stop to sin, to wipe away iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Know and understand this. From the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be rebuilt with a plaza and a moat, but in difficult times. After those 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and will have nothing. The people of the coming Prince will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come with a flood, and until the end there will be a war. Desolations are decreed. He will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and offering. And the abomination of desolation will be on a wing of the temple until the decreed destruction is poured out on the desolator. That's a weird one, once again. And it would take more time than we have altogether to walk through every little in and out of what that all means. But the short version is that the Messiah is coming and the temple will be destroyed. But that's okay. Because the coming Messiah, in addition to everything else that we've already learned about, the coming Messiah is going to put an end to sacrifice once and for all. The temple is going to be destroyed. And it was in AD 70. The temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Roman army. And so Judaism, as it existed before that, essentially stopped existing. The religion today that we refer to as Judaism has really very little to do with the Old Testament, very little to do with ancient Judaism. There's almost no relationship between them. They're fundamentally different. The old religion of the Jews is gone because the temple was destroyed, just like Daniel predicted it would be. And yet that's okay, because the coming Messiah is going to make it so that we don't need the temple anymore. He's going to make it so that we don't have to sacrifice so that we can enter the presence of God in the temple anymore, because the coming Messiah is going to make it so that we carry the presence of God around with us everywhere we go. That's the coming Messiah. We see that fulfilled in Jesus when, after he's crucified, after he's raised up, right as he begins to ascend into heaven, he tells us what? He says, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. He says, I am going away, but that's good. Because when I go away, I will send the Counselor to you. When I go away, I will send the Comforter to you. I will send the Holy Spirit to you, and the Holy Spirit will dwell within you. He'll be with you everywhere. The temple was destroyed, just like Daniel prophesied. But just like Daniel prophesied, that's okay. Because the coming Messiah has put an end to sacrifice. We don't have to sacrifice to get through to God's presence anymore, because God's presence is already with us through the sacrifice of the suffering servant. Through the sacrifice of the speaker in Psalm 22. That's the coming Messiah. That's what the Old Testament says about the coming Messiah. What I should say, actually, is that this is a little bit of what the Old Testament says about the coming Messiah. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 of the prophecies about the coming Messiah. But in all, there are over 300 prophecies in the Old Testament, and every single one of them is fulfilled either directly or indirectly by Jesus. 300. So we walked through 1/30 of the prophecies that are ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. I don't know what kind of effect just this short walkthrough of these 11 passages had on you, but imagine that effect times roughly 30. We walked through 1/30 of what the Old Testament prophesies about the coming Messiah. And every single one of them is fulfilled in some sense by Jesus. It is actually mathematically impossible for all of those messianic prophecies to have been coincidental. A mathematician named Peter W. Stoner, unfortunate last name, but this mathematician did the math, and he figured out that the probability of just 8 prophecies, so not even all of the ones we talked about, just 8. The probability of just 8 Old Testament prophecies being fulfilled by one person is 1 chance in 100 million billion. I don't know how to write that number. And 100 million billion is a million times more than the total number of people who have ever walked on planet Earth. That is how profoundly unlikely it is that any one person will fulfill even just 8 of those prophecies. Now, you can actually ratchet it up just a little bit, because Peter Stoner did the math again, and he determined that the probability of somebody fulfilling 48 of the Old Testament messianic prophecies, that's roughly 1/6 of all the Old Testament prophecies that are fulfilled by Jesus. So if you fulfilled 48 of the Old Testament messianic prophecies, that would be 1 chance in a trillion. I think that's 13 separate trillions. It is mathematically impossible for all of this to be a coincidence. And so because of that, groups like Outreach Judaism and Jews for Judaism, because of that, they have to look in different places if they want to debunk this.
So they pick and choose what they want to use. Is that what they're doing?
Well, I mean, I think it's sincere, it's genuine practitioners of Judaism who genuinely believe that Jesus was either a fraud or was just mistaken for the Messiah or something like that. And so, we fundamentally as humans, we are not reasonable beings. We are not wired to be reasonable. We do not make our decisions primarily through reason. We make our decisions primarily through emotion. People don't like to hear that, but that is the truth. And so, case in point, it would be very difficult probably to talk any of the 3 of you out of being Christians, right? And if somebody came to you and presented a bunch of really, really strong arguments for Islam, what do you think your initial reaction would be?
Crazy.
You think it was crazy. You'd get defensive, right? Then you'd go on the internet and you'd find every website you could that had any reasons why you shouldn't believe in Islam, right? You'd be in an emotional flurry and you'd go look for every single reason why that person couldn't possibly be right, right? Because they're coming at this part of you that is so deeply ingrained into who you are. Same thing is true when we try to convince practitioners of Judaism that Jesus is the Messiah. We're not just trying to convince them that they should go get a moped. We're trying to convince them that they need to fundamentally change their deepest core set of beliefs and values. And so, in response to all of this evidence, inherently, just because of the way that humans work, they look for alternative reasons why they shouldn't believe that Jesus is the Messiah. In very much the same way that you and I would have a really hard time accepting it if somebody else presented us with really convincing evidence that our religion was wrong and a different one was right. And that's part of why it's really important that probably 90% of the time, when you're sharing your faith with someone, trying to convince someone to stop believing what they believe and start believing what you believe, it's really, really helpful if you can be the calmest, least combative person, because by doing that, you rob them of the ability to write you off, and you force them essentially to keep coming back and seriously thinking about the things that you say. We're supposed to trash this book, but the Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People, right? One of the things he says in the book is that where possible, it's actually a really good idea to avoid directly contradicting a person that you're trying to convince of something. The best way to do it is to try to really roundaboutly sort of, okay, I hear what you're saying, but think about this. You kind of bring them a new thing. Okay, I hear what you're saying. Let's think about this. Kind of bring a new thing as non-aggressively as possible. This is Dale Carnegie we're talking about, right? This is a guy who wins almost all of his arguments. The reason he wins almost all of his arguments is because he gets human nature. We have these inherent roadblocks up. It's like we have these blinders just built into us, and the only way to break through the blinders usually actually is not through blunt force. It's usually actually through this really gentle, really patient, really calm, just kind of method of slowly piercing your way through other people's armor. It's like, I believe it's Proverbs 25. The proverb says, a gentle word can break a bone. You go in with a punch, you're going to break your own knuckles, but a gentle word break through the ribs. And so that's kind of what's going on here. What's happening here is it's not a bunch of cynical people who are just picking and choosing. It's not a bunch of terrible, horrible, no good, very bad people who are just, believing whatever they want and throwing the rest out. It's sincere people who are every bit as sincere as we are, but human nature has made it unbelievably difficult for them to accept that Jesus is the Messiah. And so they've typically reached for a couple of different objections, a couple of different reasons to avoid believing what's really very plain to see. One of those objections is, we call it the altered gospel argument. Essentially they say that the authors of the Gospels probably altered what actually happened to make it sound like these prophecies are being fulfilled. They'll say things like, the prophet said the Messiah's bones would not be broken. So couldn't John have just invented the story about the Romans not breaking his legs? That sounds fairly reasonable, right? Let's be honest. Or they'll say the prophet said the Messiah would be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, so couldn't Matthew have invented that story of Judas doing that? Once again, seems fairly reasonable, right? Here's the problem. We call this the the eyewitness problem. Some of this will be a little familiar if you've been to a lot of the earlier Bible studies. But when the Gospels were originally written and circulated, the people who witnessed the events of Jesus' life and death were what? Still alive, right? So, if the people who witnessed the events of Jesus' life and death were still alive, they could have debunked any falsehoods that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John invented and inserted into the story, right? Here's the problem. They were alive, and they didn't debunk any of what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John said. Instead, the eyewitnesses who were alive at the time overwhelmingly confirmed the events that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John talk about. So, if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John altered the Gospels, they would have an eyewitness problem. But they didn't have an eyewitness problem, they had an eyewitness solution, because the eyewitnesses were on their side. Secondly, we have what you could call the steadfastness problem. That is to say, it wouldn't make sense for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to willingly suffer horrific torture and death for a man they knew didn't really fulfill the Messianic prophecies. That was a long sentence, I know, but listen to it again. It wouldn't make any sense for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to go through the tortures that they went through, right? To die the deaths that they died for a man they knew wasn't really the Messiah. That's the issue with the altered Gospels theory. The altered Gospels theory means that the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John lied and said that Jesus fulfilled all these prophecies, but that they knew he really didn't. But the problem is, every one of the gospel writers was eventually martyred. They were tortured, right? Now, I'm just going to put myself in their shoes for a sec. Imagine that I'm from the first century, right? Maybe I walked with Jesus, maybe I didn't, but I write this gospel and I say Jesus fulfilled this prophecy. He fulfilled that prophecy. He fulfilled these prophecies. He fulfilled those prophecies, right? If I made that up, I know it's not true. If I invented all that, I know it isn't true, right? So now imagine I get kidnapped, I get taken in by the Roman government, and a couple of Roman soldiers start torturing me, right? And they say, we will stop torturing you. All you have to do is admit that you made this up. They start torturing me, right? They start pulling the skin off my bones. If I made all this up, eventually, I'm going to admit that I made it up, right? I don't mean to ruin your lunch, but one of the things that the Roman soldiers would do when they were trying to get people to recant their beliefs is if you were male, they would cut off one of your testicles, grind it up, and then feed it to you.
Yeah.
And then they would tell you you could keep the other one if you recanted. I think I'm a pretty strong-willed person, but about the time I'm eating my own testicle, I'm going to admit that I'm lying. I want to keep one of them. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John underwent things like that. And yet they never recanted any of what they wrote. If they had made this stuff up, if they had altered the Gospels, they could have just admitted it. They didn't.
And they would have.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
faced with that kind of torture.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way they wouldn't have admitted it.
Yeah. Then lastly, we have my favorite problem. This is, I guess you could call it the enemy's problem. And that is that the enemies of the apostles, the enemies of Jesus, the enemies of the early Christians accidentally confirm all the main points of what the four Gospels say. So the Jewish religious leaders in the first century were looking for every opportunity they could find to discredit the story of Jesus during the period where the four Gospels were originally written and circulated. Right? We actually see that, I think, in Matthew. We see the earliest stages of that. Jesus gets up and he walks out of the tomb, right? And the Sanhedrin comes to the soldiers at the tomb, and they say, "Tell everybody you fell asleep, so Jesus escaped. We'll deal with any blowback you get." Right? They say, lie and tell the people that you fell asleep, so he had an opportunity for his body to be stolen or something like that. We'll deal with it. We'll make sure you don't get in too much trouble. We see the beginning of that, right? That was the beginning of a long campaign by the Pharisees and Sadducees there in the 1st and 2nd century, trying to discredit the story of Jesus. They were looking for every opportunity they had to discredit the story of Jesus. So they could very easily have come forward if the Gospels had been altered and said, "I was there, Jesus' legs were broken." Right? They could easily have stepped forward and said, "I was there. Judas never got 30 pieces of silver. I was there. This never happened. I was there." They never said that. But even in the Talmud, like we were talking about earlier, which devotes a lot of space attempting to discredit the story of the life and death of Jesus, it never once claims that the fulfillment of the prophecies were falsified. It never once claims anything like that. It's the opposite. It just assumes that the fulfillment of all these prophecies were falsified. It starts from a point that says, okay, yeah, so all these prophecies were fulfilled in Jesus, but here's why you still shouldn't believe in him. The Talmud consistently confirms the details of the four Gospels rather than discrediting them. We talked about this a little bit a while back, but here's a really short refresher. Here's a line from the Talmud. It says, "Our rabbis taught that Jesus had 5 disciples, and these are they: Matthai, Nakwai, Netzer, Bunai, and Todah." That confirms that Jesus was a rabbi with disciples, right? Once again, another quote from the Talmud. It says, "The master said, Jesus the Nazarene practiced magic and led Israel astray." That confirms that Jesus was doing supernatural stuff, right? That Jesus was performing miracles. You might look on those miracles from the outside and say magic, but what it confirms is that you witnessed Jesus doing supernatural things, the kind of supernatural things that today people doubt the Gospels for, right? Once again, the Talmud says, no, his mother was Miriam, who let her hair grow long and was called Stadah. Pumbedita says about her, she was unfaithful to her husband. Couple of layers to that, right? First, it confirms that the circumstances of Jesus' birth were controversial, right? Isaiah 7:14, the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son. The circumstances of Mary's pregnancy were controversial because they knew she wasn't sleeping with Joseph. And so they started dragging Mary's name through the mud. Just like we see in the Gospel of Luke, people start avoiding Mary. People start calling Mary horrible names like whore. Here in the Talmud, they literally take a cheap shot at her. This doesn't really come through culturally here, but they say, Miriam, who let her hair grew long. Back then, this is weird, a woman's hair was considered her primary sex organ, I guess. Today, if a woman like breastfeeds in public, people get mad at her, right? It's stupid. She's feeding her baby, right? There's nothing sexual about that. But today we think of like female breast as being the most like aggressively sexual part of her body, culturally. And yet back then they wouldn't have cared, right? A woman was breastfeeding in public, they wouldn't have thought a thing about it. But if a woman's long hair was visible in public, they would have freaked out. Back then, if a woman's midriff was visible in public, right? We freak out about that today, right? Which is, again, silly. It's a stomach, dude. It's where you eat. Who cares? And yet, if your long hair was out back then, it would be like if my penis was out now. And so that, for one thing, that tells us a little bit about the relativity of all of this, right? We shouldn't wig out about stuff like this, but at the same time, so they were telling stories about Mary. They were saying she had this long hair and she just let it flow. They were saying Mary was a whore because they're trying to discredit the birth of Jesus. So inadvertently, what they're really doing is they're building up the case for the virgin birth of Jesus, because they're confirming what the Gospels already tell us, that the circumstances of Jesus' birth were controversial, scandalous. In the same way, later in the Talmud, it says, on Sabbath eve and the eve of Passover, Jesus the Nazarene was hanged, and a herald went forth before him 40 days heralding, Jesus the Nazarene is going forth to be stoned because he practiced sorcery and instigated and seduced Israel to idolatry. So whoever knows anything in defense may come and state it. But since they did not find anything as defense, they hanged him on the Sabbath eve and the eve of Passover. Ulah said, do you suppose that Jesus the Nazarene was one for whom a defense could be made? He was a mezit, someone who instigated Israel to idolatry, concerning whom the merciful God says, show him no compassion and do not shield him. With Jesus the Nazarene, it was different, for he was close to the government. That confirms, once again, that Jesus performed miracles, that he taught things the Jewish religious leaders considered blasphemous. We see all throughout the four Gospels, Jesus will teach something, and the religious leaders will call him a blasphemer, right? They'll call him a heretic. They'll call him an idolater. It confirms that he was tried and executed by the Sanhedrin. And it confirms that the Roman government, or Pilate, tried to intervene on his behalf. Inadvertently, they confirm the major details that the Gospels tell us about the life and death of Jesus. And then even more than that, later in the Talmud, it says, after his death, disciples start healing in the name of Jesus. They confirm the controversial stuff from the book of Acts, too, that show the apostles carrying on the supernatural ministry of Jesus. And so even the enemies of Jesus, even the enemies of the gospel writers, confirm the basic details of the Gospels. And so the altered Gospels argument doesn't work. Lastly, there's the intentional fulfillment argument. They'll say, couldn't Jesus have just read the prophecy in Zechariah that said that the Messiah would ride in on a donkey and then go purposefully find a donkey to ride in on? They say, couldn't Jesus just have read about the prophecies and then intentionally tried to fulfill them so that people would think he was the Messiah? Once again, that sounds fairly reasonable up front, right? Here's the problem. That argument works on some of the smaller, more insignificant prophecies, like the donkey prophecy. Who cares about the donkey prophecy? It's a donkey prophecy, right? But it does not work in any of the more important ones. Because, case in point, Jesus could not have caused the Sanhedrin to offer Judas 30 pieces of silver to betray him. How would he even have done that, right? Jesus could not have arranged for his ancestral heritage to match the Messianic prophecy, right? Jesus couldn't cause himself to be born into a family descended from David, right? We didn't talk about it over here, but that's part of the Messianic prophecies of the Old Testament. I didn't cause myself to be of Irish descent, right? Jesus didn't cause himself to be of Davidic descent. Well, I mean, he did, but you know what I mean, right? A normal dude could not have caused himself to be of Davidic descent. In the same way, Jesus could not have caused himself to be born in the long prophesied Bethlehem. Could he have? If he was just a dude, he couldn't have made that happen. Once again, Jesus could not have caused soldiers to gamble for his clothing, as the prophecy said. He could barely even talk on the cross. Once again, Jesus could not have prevented his legs from being broken. Once again, Jesus could not have caused himself to be raised from the dead if he was just a normal dude. He could not have caused himself to be born at the exact point in time that Daniel chapter 9 described. So the intentional fulfillment theory does not work. If you think about it for more than 5 seconds, it doesn't work. So when you take all of this together, the image that we get of Jesus is shockingly clear. Just like the prophets promised, Jesus was a prophet greater than Moses, a suffering servant, a king from Bethlehem who was born of a virgin, betrayed by his friend for 30 pieces of silver, falsely accused, crucified, resurrected, who put an end to sacrifice once and for all, and who ultimately turned out to be God with us. And then the details of his life were confirmed by a wealth of eyewitnesses. His disciples went through extreme torture and death proclaiming the story of his life, and yet they never recanted any of what they said about him. And even his enemies confirmed the truth of what the 4 Gospels say about him throughout the Talmud. The only reasonable conclusion, I think, to draw in light of all of this is that Jesus really was the Messiah. Does anybody have any questions?
God knew back way in the beginning that he was going to have to send Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing to see, like, how many signs it gives of that all throughout. Yeah. Cool. Would anybody like to dismiss us in prayer?